Well, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you all back, and really a highlight for today's conference to introduce Congresswoman Suzan DelBene. Delighted to have you with us here today. We did time this conference to take place during the congressional recess in the hopes that we would get you here, and glad that you're able to be here in person. We appreciated your video remarks for the first Pacific Technology Policy Conference a couple of years ago, and it's a pleasure to have you here in person. Let me briefly introduce you, and then we'll go into questions. For those who don't know, Congresswoman Suzan DelBene represents Washington's state's first congressional district, which is sort of east of Lake Washington and then stretching up toward the north of the state. She's served in the House of Representatives since the November 2012 election. She serves on the House Ways and Means Committee and the Tax, Trade, and Oversight subcommittees. She's also one of the co-chairs of the Women's High-Tech Coalition. And among the many pieces of legislation that she's championed on the Hill have included important work on technology, trade, taxes, health, and environmental issues. In addition to her policy career, Congresswoman DelBene began her career in medical research and immunology. She has an MBA from the University of Washington, and remarkably also spent 2 decades in a career as an executive and entrepreneur in the tech sector, and that included 12 years working at Microsoft, where she ran their mobile communications business. She helped to start drugstore.com and was the CEO of a business software company called Nimble Technology. And so what I'd like to do, Congresswoman, is begin by sort of asking you to look at both sides of your experience. Public policy for the last 14 years, but in business in the technology sector for 20 years before that. We've talked a lot during our conversations here at the conference today about the rapid growth of digital trade, the growth of AI, the issues around governance for digital trade, data privacy, AI growth. From your perspective, both in business and on the Hill, how do you see these issues right now and the sort of position that the United States is occupying?
Thank you. Am I on? The green light is on, but I don't think it's. You can. Does that sound? There you go. That sounds a lot better. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Thanks, Michael, and thanks everyone. And it's always great to be home. I always call this the better Washington, and most people here agree. So it's I think with all of the incredible innovation and the pace of innovation that we have seen, we have not seen any changes in the pace of innovation on policy. Policy is way behind, and I'd say we're way behind on technology policy, not in the U.S., but in the U.S. relative to what we've seen in other parts of the world too. We haven't done the basics, I would say. And when I say the basics, I think of things like consumer data privacy and just kind of putting the basic rules of the road of what people's rights are. Instead, we keep debating things. And as we keep debating, policy keeps moving forward and then things change. And so we even have policy that is decades old and folks are courts and others are trying to determine how you interpret policy that was written 20 years ago that maybe never anticipated the world we're in today, how policy might apply. So we need to figure out a way to have policy move more quickly, to put things in place and realize they may not last for decades, which is kind of the theory on policy. You put it in place, decades later, you update it. Instead, think about how we make steps forward, we learn. And this maybe sounds like what you would do if you were an entrepreneur. You learn what works and what doesn't work, and then you adapt and move forward. We're not very good about that in Congress for sure. And it used to be, I think we had a lot of members who did not feel very tech savvy and felt very uncomfortable about putting policy in place about things they didn't really understand. Now, I think even though people are maybe a little more tech savvy, people just aren't willing to take the bold move of putting things in place that may not work out exactly as you expect. And then you've got to learn and adapt and move forward. Instead, there's a tendency to wait. And when people always ask me what it's like in the private sector versus being in the public sector, I think one core component in the private sector, and probably is in the executive branch of government too, is it's important to decide You can wait and hear what people have to say and take an input, but deciding is critical, deciding a path forward. I think in a legislative branch, there's this tendency to not decide. There's always a reason why you shouldn't do this or do that. And yet moving forward quickly means deciding. And we've got to figure out a way to do better because we are not being well served right now in terms of making sure that we have appropriate guardrails, rules of the road, even support for innovation. And we're falling behind. And it's hard to set international norms if we don't even have domestic norms in place.
Sorry. Let's try this one. Thank you. I'm going to give you a heads up on the tricky question, which is, well, because we talked a lot this morning with various speakers here at the conference about different models for sort of regulating this fast-moving technology. And you can sort of have a state-driven data sovereignty model, which maybe China might be adopting. You can have a very rules-based EU-type model. And the US model seems to be sort of let the private sector go a little bit and kind of work with them to have things evolve. The tricky question, which I'm going to come to you just to give you some time to think about it, would be what I see happening here is that lack of movement on Capitol Hill, so the lack of national level legislation, but activities and discussions taking place at the state level in different jurisdictions. So how do you start to square those would be the tricky one. But I'm going to ask you the easy question first. If the system were working exactly as you'd like it to, and you could sort of design and implement the kind of flexible policy framework that you think would be necessary, what would some of the key components of that be that would regulate digital trade, data privacy, some of the issues that you just mentioned?
Well, I might end up answering your earlier question as I answer this one too. So I might combine them because first of all, I do think we need consistent rules of the road that are federal because otherwise people don't know what their rights are. It's hard to know what your rights are on data privacy if it's different when you're in Washington state and then you get on a plane and go to another state and your rights have changed. One, it's really hard from a business standpoint to implement that and to keep up. And I think this idea that my rights change based on my physical presence is also something that I don't think everyone's really contemplated. It's not like I'm a Washington state resident. And so my privacy rights, if they were, written by Washington state, I carry them with me when I go. They change where I go. And so, so I'm a big proponent on federal legislation on data privacy. I would start there. I always go back to data privacy because I think it's foundational. When we talk about things like AI, et cetera, all of these things fundamentally come back to data. And if we don't have rules of the road about how we and what rights are around data, it's hard to think of how you start to build on top of that because you're always going back to kind of figuring out where those building blocks are, even if you're trying to do policy up here. So, but of course, states are going to move in the absence of any movement at the federal level, and they have been serving as kind of those pilots. But again, to have consistent rules across the country, for people to have consistent rights across the country, we need federal policy. So I personally have led an effort on federal data privacy legislation as an example, and I've been working on this for years, unfortunately, because we don't have anything across the finish line. And it is also hard for us to be at the international table if we don't have domestic, and when I say domestic, I mean federal policy, because we don't really have a position to take in the absence of that. And the states don't have consistent policy. It's a patchwork. So what does it mean? What's the fundamental policy? So I would say kind of the answer to all the questions, we have to start fundamentally. I think privacy and data is the place that you start. And I think it has to be federal. And clearly on AI, there has been a movement, there had been an attempt to try to block states from moving, but we can't say states can't do anything because they have to wait and the federal government does nothing. That's not a great solution either. States, I think, are understandably are going to move. And what we need to do is we need on the federal side to move and to set that foundational policy. And it's going to get harder and harder the longer we wait, just like it gets harder internationally the longer we wait, because places like the EU or China or others start putting policy in place. And it's harder for us to put policy in place that has an impact because people are adapting to what they're seeing from others. So waiting is not a great option either. I'm not sure if I got everything you asked, but I did my best.
You did. Is this working? Okay, great. I wanted to actually go there next and sort of move from this challenge between the federal and the state level here within the United States, but thinking very specifically about how the US is going to work with its partners and other competitors. In our case at NBR, we focus on the Indo-Pacific, but this is a broader global challenge. So given the complexity of these issues, how best can the United States help US companies as different jurisdictions worldwide are introducing rules around data localization or data sovereignty, very different standards about privacy concerns that might negatively impact US consumers and users, US corporate interests? I mean, what would you like to see from the US as an international actor in terms of promoting some of the outcomes that you think would be most beneficial, that would allow the market to do what it does well, while also protecting the rights of individuals and consumers?
Well, I think a key part is working in, first of all, having domestic policy so you have a position, and then you can work to develop commonality internationally is really important. And so we need to do both. We need to do our part, and we need to be working with partners around the world, talking about, and whether it's through multilateral agreements, bilateral agreements, but to create that commonality. And I know if I take an example of something, we were trying to get digital chapters into trade agreements. And I know the conversations we had around the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that was really a fundamental digital chapter because we didn't have digital chapters anywhere. And I think there was a lot of important and good work that was done there, and a lot of commonality between what was there that ended up in USMCA as well. But I think those are going to be critically important to create those standards and to create that dialogue back and forth about what does it mean to, to make sure that we have the openness that's going to be important for business to be able to be successful. It's really hard with strict data localization for folks to have that strong of a physical presence everywhere and still have everything work. Clearly, we also have places like the WTO that have also tried to bring folks together. And, we just saw the e-commerce moratorium not get removed. It ended in Cameroon. It was not renewed. That's hugely challenging too, because if we're going to think about what we do going forward, if this is now every transaction is going to be, tariffed or duties are going to create much more complexity around the innovation and kind of how does that take place. Just think, I'm on the Ways and Means Committee, and we do taxes and trade, but and many of you may know, the amount of time we spent trying to deal with digital assets and physical presence in the tax code. Tax code was very much based on physical presence and physical goods. And so trying to talk about how the tax code changed was very much an international, and still is at the OECD, an international conversation. So if you think about this too, on the trade side, if we're going to see something like the e-commerce moratorium go away, it raises huge questions and challenges for how people conduct business in many ways. And I'm very concerned about it. I was someone who wanted to see that made permanent, and clearly there was disagreement there. But I think while folks try to think about how they make revenue, I don't think they're being thoughtful about the complications it's going to create and take away opportunities from businesses' ability to operate when you start having more and more not just regulatory environment, but kind of the duties and the extra costs for doing simple transactions really make it harder and harder for folks that know how to move forward, and absolutely will make it very, very hard for smaller businesses, which have really benefited from the openness that we've seen.
I'm going to ask you to follow that thread a little bit. Anthony Cook from Microsoft gave the keynote remarks first thing this morning, and one of the things he was talking about was the tech stack and the fundamental importance at the bottom of the stack of the key inputs that physically drive the digital revolution, the digital growth that we're seeing. So how do you secure energy supplies to power data centers? how do you bring in the chips that would actually be nested within the servers and the systems that you need to build these systems and the software on top of those? So you just mentioned the impact and the unpredictability from the tariffs regime we've seen over the last year or so. We're in an environment where the CHIPS Act had big impacts, and those are changing now. Tell us a little bit about what you think on the sort of semiconductor side, the energy side, some of the underlying pieces that are sort of fueling this technology sector.
Well, certainty and stability are really important. They're important in policy, they're important in business, they're important for planning, especially for anything that's going to take some time to get moving. And chips and science was just a really important investment that we were making to help bring semiconductor manufacturing into the US, to help bring the talent. But it is not something that you put money in and poof, it's all running. This is a long-term investment. I mean, you all know this, but the fact that now people aren't sure about whether or not a U.S. commitment is going to be stable and long-lasting. We see this in, look at locally, we had under the Biden administration, and there had been hydrogen hubs designated across the country to help facilitate investment in hydrogen and clean hydrogen, and then a new administration comes in and poof, it's gone. People started making those investments, planning for the future. Very skeptical then later on about whether, and that's a huge concern I have, whether it's not just the dollars, but permitting reform, the talent that's required in terms of bringing people in to make sure we have the workforce that's required, whether it's the training and educational side or bringing people into the United States, and immigration policy. All of these things play an important role in terms of making sure that a long-term investment is going to actually pay off. And so tariffs, obviously, tariffs on a whim where, you said something mean to me, so poof, tariff on you now. Unfortunately, that's kind of what policy has been like now. And so it makes it very, very hard for someone who's trying to make a decision in any business, and semiconductors being a great example, for us to foresee where we need to be 10 years from now if we're not sure if the policy landscape or the financing landscape or the workforce landscape are going to be stable. And so it's going to be very, very important. And this is and I don't just say this because I'm a member of the House of Representatives, but I am a member of the House of Representatives. Congress, the important role that Congress plays on tariffs and trade and international commerce is to help provide that certainty and stability. If we have the recent tariffs, and the Supreme Court, I think, absolutely made the right decision, need to be approved by Congress. So I can't just on a whim say, no, I'm going to do this and change the environment. Congress would do that. That gives you that certainty and stability from a business standpoint. And on trade agreements, not just a handshake agreement, but a truly binding trade agreement where you go through Congress and you get a vote, and it's hard and no one likes having to do it. But when we do, we get something that's much more enduring and long lasting. All of these things are important for these long-term investments, and are equally important if we're going to see the results that we want to see and we think are critical in places like semiconductors, where we know there's a strategic reason why we need to be there. But we also know, and we have to work with partners because not all the supply chain pieces come together, but we need there to be that trust and that stability and that certainty to make sure we get the best results and the investments that are necessary to get there.
TPP, you mentioned CPTPP. TPP was, I think, the last time there was sort of a broad move in Washington, D.C. toward a comprehensive trade agreement. What would it take for that opportunity to arise again in Washington? I mean, when will Congress next really be willing to look at a trade agreement with all the complexities of today's digital economy and actually sort of look at something in a systematic way?
Well, I do think USMCA passed in a bipartisan way under the first Trump administration, even though he has tried to blow it up. It was passed was a bipartisan agreement. And actually, as I said, there were pieces like digital chapter, et cetera, where I think foundationally a lot of work that had been done on TPP informed that. So it went through even in a contentious environment, and people came together, and I think a strong deal was put in place. Is it perfect? No. I think like everything, and kind of to my very first comments, we have to learn, and now we'll have a review and see what's working and not working. But unfortunately, it's hard to do that now when outside of the agreement you have a tariff regime and in place. You're not using kind of traditional mechanisms. You've kind of now gone around the deal, the actual trade agreement. So it makes it hard for folks, again, to trust and wonder what the next step is going to be going forward. And so I think we need to go back to doing those types of deals, real trade deals. I know they're hard. I know we've got some folks who've negotiated deals here before. I know they're hard, but they are important because they provide that certainty and stability, and they create this commonality, kind of that baseline that you're talking about. And we haven't done as much on the digital side. I'm co-chair of the Digital Trade Caucus, and we're trying to build up that awareness and knowledge on digital trade. People think a lot about, agriculture, environmental standards, and labor standards, but not everybody thought about digital as much. And it seems like something, of course, we should worry behind, but we're way behind. And I think a lot of folks are behind in terms of thinking about the digital side when they've thought about trade agreements in the past. And so we have a huge opportunity to do more. Other countries are doing more. Like you said, CPTPP and others, but the U.S. I think has an opportunity to be engaged. And again, as innovators and leaders in these areas, to make sure that we're being thoughtful and have that input in where policy is going.
I want to come back and finish with the international cooperation, but before I get there, I'd like to ask you to come back to the state level and thinking about Washington State. What could happen here at the state level? This is a tech hub. We're a very trade-dependent state. In the context of both the uncertainty, but also the agreements that have been reached recently between the United States and Japan and South Korea and Taiwan for big investments into the United States. What are the opportunities for Washington State? For cities like Seattle, for the folks down in Olympia, to strengthen that collaboration with our partners in Asia in the context of this opportunity to make the supply chain more resilient, sort of encourage those partnerships and the other areas that would sort of provide that foundational strength that would allow the growth to continue.
I think we're very well positioned. One, we have incredible assets here in Washington State, and we have been a very innovative region. So we've got that baseline that is critically important. We have a close relationship with Asia, obviously Asia facing, but many connections. And I think there's been a lot of human capital back and forth that have built not only the investments from Asia into the U.S., but also from the U.S. into Asia, and an incredible collaboration that we've seen for decades. The challenge is making sure that federal policies don't prevent a lot of that from continuing, because I think at Washington State, there's still that desire to connect and move forward. And I think from many of the conversations we've had with Asian partners around the world, there's a very strong desire to see that continue, not just in Washington, but with the U.S. And policy is going to be part of what helps enable that to happen. But we are in an incredible region, and it's the talent, the investments that have already made kind of that foundational infrastructure that we have here, I think are critical, and also incredibly beautiful place too. So not a bad place for folks to come be. But I just want to make sure that we're removing the barriers to that. And we are very trade dependent. So we have felt strongly the impacts of tariffs and that instability, whether it's with Asia or with our northern neighbor in Canada. Just traffic back and forth across the border is down, tourism's down, goods produced in the U.S. in Washington, like wine is a good example. Used to be sold in British Columbia. And then when tariffs and the disparaging comments started, British Columbia no longer sells Washington wine, not because they don't like Washington wine or we don't have a close connection with the state, but because of what's happened at the federal level. And that's my concern about making sure that that's not the barrier that gets in the way.
Great. Well, let me finish with a final question. We've had speakers here at the conference today who've traveled from Japan, from Singapore, from Taiwan, from Korea. We've heard a range of perspectives from the US's partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific region. What would be the message that you would like to share with them in terms of how you think the United States can best work with them on issues like AI governance, digital trade, the growth of this digital economy?
Well, I think we need to continue. I think there's been just incredible foundation that we talked about, and we are, like-minded partners who have been working well together for so long. We also agree in terms of the types where we want to see technology and innovation move forward, many shared values. And I think when we see a big player like China and kind of more of an authoritarian view of policy and how data or AI should work, we have the opportunity together to build a really strong kind of counter point of view to that. And it's going to be from everyone working together. So when I talk to folks, when I've had the opportunity to talk to folks throughout the Indo-Pacific, and that same desire and willingness to work together and make a difference is there. We've got to work together to address, and we have to do our part in Washington, D.C. to continue to not put new barriers in place. But I think we have that great opportunity, and I think it's the trust and the dialogue and the investments and ongoing and the agreements that kind of solidify that are critically important. And I just have to say, there is a huge willingness I'd say a bipartisan willingness to see that continue and to invest in that, even though some of the actions that we've seen from the administration may be counterintuitive to that. I think the majority of people, when you talk across the country, want to see that move forward, and that gives me a lot of hope that we're going to get to a better place.
Well, let's finish on that note. Please join me in thanking Congresswoman Suzan DelBene for joining us.